Good evening, everyone. I am so happy that you're all here for a second evening of public programming at the Ford. I am Brooke Clement, the director here at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, Hostages No More, with former Secretary of Education, Betsy DeVos. Thank you to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation for supporting the library and museum's programming and exhibits. We have some exciting programming coming up in the next several weeks, including author talks with Wayman Britt, John Spencer, and Jonathan Darman. And we'll also be bringing back the Presidential Express Train exhibit this holiday season. And we'll be hosting a temporary exhibit from the National Guitar Museum entitled America at the Crossroads, the Guitar and a Changing Nation, which will start at the end of January. For further dates and details of these and more, please check out our website at fordlibrarymuseum.gov. Before I introduce Gleaves, though, I want to remind anyone, if you have the cards for questions and answers at the end of the event, I'd like you to please jot your question down and then pass your card to the end of the row, either side, and somebody will pick those up because we will be using those to provide questions and answers at the end of the evening. So we're going to be collecting those ahead of time. So if you're done, please pass them down. And now I would like to welcome Gleaves Whitney, the Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, to introduce our guest and moderate the conversation.
Always so good to see this auditorium filling up. Welcome. Thanks, Brooke. I'm so pleased to add my welcome to yours, given this wonderful audience. I think we could turn down the mic just a little bit, please. Yep, thank you very much. What a wonderful audience with all the friends of Ford, the current trustees of the foundation, former trustees of the foundation. Welcome. It's always great to see you here. And greetings also to those of you who are watching online. Well, this is the first time I've had the privilege of introducing tonight's distinguished guest. Native of Holland, Michigan, spouse of Dick DeVos, chairman of the Michigan Republican Party, 11th U.S. Secretary of Education, champion of education freedom, noted mentor and generous philanthropist. Betsy DeVos has lived a life of significance, and she needs no introduction to this audience. Or maybe she does. It's easy to caricature people who are in the public limelight, especially when they're our neighbors. But when they tell you their story and you really listen, when you step back from the public polemic and you see the person's heart, you see the way their mind works, you see what really makes them tick. And then you see what makes them love, laugh, fall down, cry, get back up, and try harder. When you see all this, it humanizes them. You see them in a new way and not just as a political caricature. It's easy to caricature people, but Betsy's book, Hostages No More, breaks through that wall of caricature. And it has the effect of being a terrific read, and in my opinion, an even better listen. I wish she could sign the Audible portion of her book, because listening to Betsy's authentic voice, 11 hours of her voice, 10.5 to 11 hours, read the book, is a moving experience. Betsy, I have to admit, I was surprised how moving it was, but your voice really does come through beautifully. Well, you may learn many things about the life of Elizabeth D. Prince that connect us all as human beings. You learn how middle class her early childhood was in their 2-bedroom home in Holland that they call the Little Red House, with a little white fence around it. You learn how hard her father worked to provide for his growing family that only had one car. You learn how unsatisfactory and frustrating her time in school was, because as she puts it, she was a tomboy. And this is relevant to our venue this evening. You learn how enthusiastically she campaigned for President Ford in 1976 as a scatter blitzer. I think this is the only place in the world that knows what a scatter blitzer is. You learn how she and Dick almost lost their first child just hours after the birth. And like a golden thread through the entire book, you learn how deep and abiding her passion is to improve the educational opportunities for every child. Because Betsy DeVos knows that children may be only 25% of our population, but they're 100% of our future. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the Honorable Betsy DeVos to our stage. Okay, we're good, aren't we? All right, I'm getting the thumbs up back there. Well, Betsy, thank you for joining us this evening. It really is great to have you here to talk about a book that I think is really an important read because it tackles two things that are really important in our public life today. First of all, it tackles the willingness of good people to serve in public. Public service is a dying art because so many good people are chased away from the opportunity. So, thank you for that. And then it also tackles topically such an important issue of education and your dedication to it. So I look forward to asking you some questions about that. We'll get to education in just a moment. But when I told people that you'd be coming to our stage again and again, the first thing that they said, ask her, what is it like to serve in the cabinet? What's it like, to be nominated, go through that process, and then the end when you left, I think, if my math is right, on your birthday. Right, so tell us a little bit about that whole process.
Well, Gleaves, first of all, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here this evening, and to so many folks that I had the chance to say hello to before we came into the auditorium. I'm honored to be here and spend a few moments with you to talk about those experiences and the things that I've learned and things that I think we need to do for kids. But, the experience was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. And not having ever aspired to be a member of the cabinet, I'm not sure I really anticipated what it was going to be like. And it was just, there were so many moments where I had to remind myself that this is not something that most people ever get the opportunity to do. And there was never a moment, there was never a time, and Dick would attest to this as well. Thank you for being here tonight, honey. Going, for different events or things at the White House. Every time we were in the White House, it was like, wow, this is the White House. We're really here. This is pretty cool. But doing the job and serving the people of this country, but most importantly, serving the kids was a high honor. And I was privileged to work with a great team of the political appointees that came in with me. In the Department of Education, there are about 4,000 employees, and there are about 100 political appointees. So it was a very small group of people that came in and worked, shoulder to shoulder with me. We found a few of the career staff that were aligned or would be agreeable and try to help us meet the goals that we set. But there were a lot of frustrations with that as well. A lot of frustrations because the orientation within that building was very much around adult issues, not around what's best for kids. And we tried to reorient that to the greatest extent possible.
You make that distinction again and again in the course of this book, Hostages No More, that the system is really made for adults and not children.
Well, I knew it for many, many years before. I mean, look, I'd worked on behalf of, to advocate for policies that would empower families and kids to find their right education fit for 30 years before I went to Washington. So I was not new to the opposition, but I think it was even more evident in Washington just how formidable the status quo orientation is, and the orientation around doing things for the system, for adults within the system, and not in the best interest of the kids that they're supposed to serve. Like I said, we tried to orient everything around making decisions that were going to be best for children. And I just want to reference the title of the book, Hostages No More, is a admittedly provocative title, but it was done so intentionally because it's a direct reference to a quote made by Horace Mann, who is commonly known as the father of our K-12 education system. And he said at the founding of that system that educators are entitled to look upon parents as having given hostages to our cause. And we saw that in so many ways within, working within the department. And we saw that clearly in so many ways in the last couple of years when the system really served itself rather than the children it's supposed to be serving.
Well, it's interesting. I think you make the point somewhere in the book that if you go to so many sectors of our economy, for example, if you pick up an iPhone and you compare what an iPhone is today to what phones were like, when we were kids, for example, the old rotary phone, the one in the kitchen, and it's changed enormously, the technology. Medicine, now you have, robotics, you have AI actually doing surgery compared to 50, 60, 70 years ago, been unthinkable. But when it comes to education, we're basically still in the old Prussian model of sort of preparing young people to work in factories with the bell and,
No, exactly. I mean, the model, the basic approach to how kids learn in their K-12 years has not fundamentally changed in the 175 years since that system was founded. And I go into this in some length in the book about the fact that Horace Mann died 20 years before Alexander Graham Bell invented the telephone. So he never dreamt of making a phone call. And you think about the fundamentally different ways we communicate today from when that the original phone was invented. And it's just kind of mind-blowing to think about how antiquated the system that all of our kids go through is as compared to the way we communicate through telephone and now, with one little device in multiple ways in a matter of nanoseconds.
Well, in the audience, I notice we have Annette Kirk, who also has the distinction of working in a pioneering way on education reform. You go back and look at your work, Annette, I think it was in the early 80s, right?
The Reagan administration.
The Reagan administration, and
first
the report that came out, A Nation at Risk. Now, that would have been a pioneering report for its time. How much have things changed from, say, when A Nation at Risk was produced 40 years ago to today?
Well, not much at all. And as Annette will attest to, she tried very hard to, help facilitate President Reagan following through on his pledge to get rid of the Department of Education. Many people don't know the department was not founded until 1979 as a payoff to Jimmy Carter's payoff to the teachers union for having endorsed him for president in 1976, the first time the teachers unions endorsed a presidential candidate. And so the founding in 1979 was clearly just months, maybe slightly over a year before President Reagan took office. And it would have been an ideal time to sunset an organization that I would argue needs to be sunset today. I do not think the Department of Education has a role in the future because it has not fulfilled the role it was initially set up to serve, and that was to ostensibly to close the achievement gap between the highest performing students and the lowest performing ones. Over $1 trillion spent at the federal level alone since then, and those achievement gaps have not narrowed one little bit. In fact, by many measures, they've actually widened. And so you really have to ask yourself, why do we keep spending more and more and more money doing the same thing, putting it behind the same approach, the same system, and expect different results? And as Albert Einstein often said, that was the model of, that was the definition of insanity. So I believe there's every reason to look at that very carefully today, because that concentration of energy around protecting and perpetuating a system has only grown stronger and stronger over the years. I believe the last 2 years have called that into question like never before. And so now I think is the ideal time to really push and talk about how we get power back to families, states, local communities.
Well, you mentioned internally, just within the United States, the gap, the achievement gap that had been growing all these years, but also internationally. How are American kids doing, say, in these longitudinal tests?
Well, not well. And even before the pandemic, we've continued to fall further and further behind our competitive counterparts nationwide. So before the pandemic, before other countries went back to school in person much sooner than our country did in general, the PISA scores, the international assessment, the only assessment of learning for K-12 students internationally, we were 13th in reading, 18th in science, and 37th in math. And that was before the pandemic, where all the data that's come out recently it hasn't dealt with the international comparisons, but internally we know from the NAEP, the Nation's Report Card, most recent data, 9-year-old kids for the first time were plummeting scores in both reading and in math. And I think it was 10 points in reading, 12 points in math, 15 if you were a Black boy. So it is not tenable to keep doing the same thing we've been doing, which is why the flip side, the good side, the silver lining to the pandemic is that for the first time ever, families have said, we support this notion of choosing and deciding where our children go to school, to the tune of about 3 out of 4 individuals nationwide. The support for education freedom has never been higher, and we're seeing policymakers finally get the drift on that and start to seriously consider and pass policies that are going to bring about the freedom that families need.
Well, this is interesting because here at the Ford, we're always interested in trying to find the center of gravity of a debate. You know, President Ford's, you were a scatterblitzer, you know his technique. President Ford's way of legislating was often to try to figure out where the middle was, find somebody on the other side of the aisle with whom he could work, and then together they would start to build a coalition for meaningful change. Where is the center now? We're so polarized, Betsy. How do we even identify a center where you can make your argument?
Well, it's very difficult, and particularly with the subject of education, because the system headed by the teachers' unions at the top, calling the shots. When you look at reports around where their political advocacy dollars go, 99.7% of them go to Democrat elected officials or Democrat candidates for office who pledge to do their bidding. And it's become a vicious cycle. It really has. So today, when I was in the confirmation process, one of my longtime friends and allies in the battle for education freedom, Cory Booker, senator from New Jersey, did a 180 because he wanted to run for president. And he actually said, I was taken to the broom closet by the teachers union and basically told, you need to fall in line and support what we demand of you, or you won't get any support from us. And so it's very difficult. But I have optimism that that is changing, because the political window of opportunity, and many in this room will know the Joe Overton window, political window of opportunity has opened like it never has before. And that, I believe, is going to ultimately bring unlikely support around this issue and this policy.
So you're at the Department of Education at a particularly fraught time in U.S. history, where there's so much change. Of course, the pandemic comes along. And what would you say, given the environment there, what would you say were your chief, let's go through two things, accomplishments, but also disappointments, and in any order you want?
Sure. Well, we did a lot of good behind-the-scenes work to reduce the number of, so first of all, the orientation totally around doing the right thing for students at whatever level, whether it's K-12 or higher ed, the higher education level, and really thinking about them as the real focus of the work for and on behalf of education. And so we pushed as much decision-making and control back to the states and local districts as we could under law. We didn't add all kinds of regulation and strings to the appropriated funds from Congress, outside of which often, as we all know, many administrative federal agencies do add all kinds of regulatory requirements that make it that much more difficult to ultimately make decisions on the local level. We turned as much of that over to the states as possible under the law. We got rid of a lot of regulations that were antiquated and or outside, extraneous to the laws. Importantly, we did rulemaking work around the issue of sexual misconduct on campuses, commonly known as Title IX. And this was probably the most difficult and controversial thing that we had to navigate through. And right now, that is this administration is attempting to undo all that and actually go much further to the left than our predecessors had under the Obama administration, basically throwing out any kind of due process protections, and also fundamentally changing the definition of biological sex. And if that is achieved, it will essentially moot Title IX, because Title IX was passed as a protection or a guarantee of equal opportunity for both genders to access education, and it's commonly become known as the equalizer for women's sports. But you cannot say biological men can participate on women's sports teams and then call it fair for women and women's sports. So that's a whole nother issue that this administration is trying to undo. But I think that I know that our approach and our process for doing it has been tested in courts, and there are many ways that if the rule is changed too fundamentally, that the courts will ultimately find it out of bounds. So, but The other thing that I'm particularly proud of was championing the establishment of a federal tax credit that would provide rocket fuel to what the states are doing to provide education freedom policy in their states. So it would have established a $5 billion annual tax credit that would be distributed out to states that wanted to then scholarship it out to families according to the parameters they put around it. And I'm pleased to see, while the biggest disappointment probably was not being able to get that passed, I'm very optimistic that that is ultimately going to get introduced and passed very soon, because the the momentum around supporting it has grown substantially.
Well, I know the audience is going to ask more questions about this. Brooke, are we anywhere near getting audience questions? What's that? Okay, very good. Well, I think we can explore more of these issues through the prism of your leadership. I was really struck by a line in the epilogue of the book. Permit me to read it, it's very short. "Quitting isn't in my DNA. I've often said you owe it to your ideas to win." I mean, talk about just a Sherman-esque statement. I love that. And I wish more of our young people had that attitude, that can-do grit. So I'd like to ask you, you have had to be really tough in your career on a number of occasions, with my boss at one point, and to remain standing, to fight another day. And I'm wondering, where does that come from, that inner tenacity of yours? And what can you convey to our young people who are looking to be leaders and need to figure out how to do that, overcoming all of their deficiencies and imposter syndrome and all the things that young people worry about today?
Well, that's a great question, Cleves. I think that I probably attribute a lot of the foundation of that to, growing up in my family. And I had parents who were, very encouraging of me and my siblings to, to consider ideas, to debate ideas, to, formulate opinions and have good arguments for them, and not be afraid to express them respectfully, but to express them. And so it was, I remember plenty of dinner time conversation about different topics of the day, and that sort of helped me in my earlier years. But it's been relatively easy for me to stay. It's been easy for me to stay focused on kids and families who haven't had a voice. And those are the families I've been advocating for 3.5 decades. And in spite of what those who oppose my ideas will say, that's where my heart has been. And it's easy to stay true to that in the face of lots of opposition, because I know it's the right place to be. And I'm happy to get pushback on specific pieces of policy, but you cannot tell me that it's okay for me and my family and those with means to choose our children's education, but somebody who doesn't have those means to not have the same kinds of opportunities that my family has had, and that many others here in this room and in our communities across the country have had. It's just, you cannot tell me that that is fair or right or just, and that is what has continued to drive me.
Okay, for education freedom.
Yeah.
Well, so there's the tough side of you, but there's also what I think comes out in this book so clearly too is the tender side of you. I mean, I think back to some of the stories where you've done a lot of volunteering that I don't think people are aware of. But I think of, for example, Sasha, or name changed, but that's what you call her in the book. And you have learned how people have struggled by being with these families. Talk talk about where that comes from too. The tough side of you over there that you just addressed, but this tender side of you that reaches out to people who really need help.
Sure. Well, I was really privileged to have the experience of mentoring two young girls starting, the first one starting in second grade and the second one starting in first grade. And I still am, I'm sure that she will consider me a mentor today. We still see one another with fairly regular frequency. And today she is in college, and she would probably tell you she would never have had she probably wouldn't have stuck to even graduating high school, and much less go to college. She's the second, her older sister went to college as well, but first generation going to college. But for me, having the experience of seeing and being up close to families who were struggling to put food on the table and to make ends meet, and to better understand, what what their daily struggles have been, and the needs that they have, it has really informed my opinions and perspectives on a lot of things. And I wanted to have those personal experiences because it's very helpful for me, and it's been as much a blessing for me as it probably has for her to have that relationship and to learn from one another, and in the process to grow.
I often joke with our mentors, well, you hear this with the mentors, say it over and over again to their mentees. The mentors often do get more out of it than the mentees, because they see all this energy and enthusiasm, and there's kind of a transference of that, which can reinvigorate.
Well, and if I could just add to that, the program that I did this through is called Kids Hope USA, and I'm sure many in this room are familiar with it. But I initially served on the board or the advisory group around the board of Kids Hope, and the more I learned from that perspective, the more I was intent about actually being a mentor myself. And what I love about Kids Hope in particular is the constancy, the faithfulness of, you make a commitment for at least a year to go and be with that child for 1 hour, 1 day a week in their school, at their location. And it's not with a big agenda. It's just there to love and encourage them. And so it really has been a real tremendous blessing for me and for others in my family who have mentored as well. And I'm sure if any of you in this room have also done it, it's really been life-changing.
What is the biggest misconception that you find yourself fighting about you?
I don't honestly know, because I don't pay attention to so much of the nonsense out there. I'm sure it's any number of things that people think about me that are completely false or wrong. But again, I have just sort of stayed laser focused on the things that I need to do to help kids and families, and I hope that the real me will somehow get through to the people that care about actually learning about people and not just taking caricatures.
Well, it's my understanding from talking to you and Nate, this is the 49th stop in your book tour, that's incredible. The book hasn't been out that long. I guarantee you that is a tough schedule. And I imagine you have encountered all kinds of questions and issues, because it's a coast-to-coast book tour. You've been to California, you've been to our sister institutions at the Nixon, at the Reagan, for example. So what are you finding is the mood out there as the American people are dealing with your book, your ideas, and your person as a leader who combines both the tough-minded side with the tender experience? How's
How's this working?
Well, I think, like I said earlier, I think the last 2 years have really opened the eyes of so many families, so many parents, so many grandparents, friends, neighbors, open their eyes to the reality of a system that for many of us we've known for years has not worked, has failed too many kids, too many families, because of the way the system navigated the pandemic with extensive and lengthy lockdowns, mask mandates that came and went, distance learning that came and went, low quality distance learning, in some cases not even really trying to help serve kids. And then, parents had a front row seat to see what their kids were actually learning, whether in the kitchen, at the kitchen table or the living room or wherever. And in many cases, they were very understandably upset and disappointed, whether it was the total lack of rigor in the distance learning that was being provided, or even if it was relatively well presented, maybe still not very academically challenging, or material that was being fed to and or presented to their children that was totally age inappropriate, whether it was sexual content that was not appropriate for kindergartners to third graders, or the curriculum that was just antithetical to their values completely. And so there's any number of reasons that that folks have really awakened and are paying attention to education like never before. And I think it's long overdue from my perspective, but what it does is allow for the kinds of policy change that I've long advocated need to happen. We're seeing it happen. Last year, 26 states either expanded education freedom programs or introduced new ones, passed new ones, and are implementing them now. The state of Arizona is the first state to have have passed and have the governor sign a education savings account that is universally available to every student in the state of Arizona. This is a groundbreaking move, and I was talking to Governor Doug Ducey from Arizona last week, and we were talking about this very issue, and he's, I said, I predict it's not going to be long before a lot of other governors who are pretty competitive are going to say, well, wait a minute, we're not going to let Arizona leave us in the dirt. And he said, it's like, how many years or how long did individuals try to break the 4-minute mile? And then once it was broken, it was like a floodgate. And I think that's very true. I think we're going to see a lot more policies that are much broader in scope and that will actually fundamentally change the delivery and experience of K-12 learning. One example, because when we talk about education freedom, it's I think sometimes difficult to envision what that might look like, because we have such a fixed idea of what K-12 education is. I mean, we've known and understood it to be pretty much the same for 175 years. But I think about a little school in the Holland area that, and we live in Michigan. We know it's cold and snowy in the winter. This little elementary school, the kids go to school year-round, outdoors every day. And they have a waiting list for this little school. Now, this is just one delivery model that's completely different than what most kids experience every day. But I use it as a small example of thinking differently about what education can look like. And Arizona is actually a state that is quite a ways down the track in this, because out of necessity, in their urban areas in particular, they had a lot of families who, and they had a unique mechanism because of a charter school that could help them with the resources. But a lot of the families from urban areas in Arizona started basically, I call them 21st century one-room schoolhouses with multi-age children. They hired a great teacher, And they want to continue this, and they want to build on it. And there's others who want to model this same approach. And micro schools and learning pods. And we've seen an explosion in homeschooling and homeschool cooperatives. And so policies that are going to support this kind of creative, experimental approach to how to untap, tap that potential in every child is going to be a really, really great thing for our future. And more states are going to adopt stuff like this.
How are we doing educating boys?
Well, I mean, I don't want to stereotype, but I didn't love being in a seat in a classroom all day, every day. There's a lot of kids that don't learn best that way. There's lots of ways that you can help kids learn that don't require sitting lined up in rows and desks. And that's what we need to be allowing facilitation. And in facilitating is different kinds of approaches to learning, much of it hands-on or like this little school in Holland, outdoors, running around all day and getting the energy out and also getting the learning done.
You've just mentioned several states, Arizona namely, but how's Michigan doing in education reform right now?
Well, Michigan is on the precipice of a really important step, and I don't know if you all have paid attention to the Let My Kids Learn initiative, but last fall, the legislature passed a bill that would establish an education savings account here in Michigan. It is income-based education savings account, so it would be for families with for a family of four up to an income level of about $100,000. And for that, if you fell under that limitation and your child's assigned school is not working for him or her, you could take 90% of what the state currently spends for that child and use it to buy that child's education wherever you wanted else. Not surprisingly, the governor vetoed that legislation, but in Michigan we have a provision where if enough signatures are gathered from Michigan voters, that same legislation can get represented back to the legislature. If they pass it again, it becomes law without the governor's signature. And right now, the status is all of the signatures have been presented to the Secretary of State. And once those are certified as having been valid, enough valid signatures, then that will go back to the legislature. And they've passed it before, so I'm very confident that they are going to do it again.
Now, let's say, this will be my last question before we open it up to the audience. Let's say, okay, we're going to get through some elections here, as you know, real soon. And then 2024 is going to start. It's going to be really hot on both sides, both Republicans and Democrats. And say you were called in to consult with a candidate, and you were invited to say this is what the education agenda should be for 2024. What would you tell that individual?
Well, I would say support and embrace education freedom, support parents, support kids, and champion a federal tax credit, and champion phasing out the Department of Education and returning those monies, ideally to families, but certainly to the local communities to be able to better serve the students they're supposed to serve.
I've just got to point out, President Ford was the last president we had who did not have a Department of Education.
That's right.
Kind of an interesting
that's
contrast.
right.
Nate, thank you for reminding me that in our phone call the other day.
Well, and the HEW secretary under President Carter, Joseph Califano, had actually warned, and I write about this in the book too, had warned about the establishment of the Department of Education as he believed it should not happen, that it was a matter for the states. You know, there's nowhere in our Constitution that talks about the role of the federal government in education. And so, you know, Jimmy Carter did not have unanimity in his own party. And I think that if Califano could come back today and speak some words of wisdom, he'd probably have some observations to make about what, you know, has become of that agency.
Yes. Brooke, thank you.
We've got some questions here, and, you know, I'm gonna do my best with some of this handwriting, I'm sorry. Do you think public schools will ever meet the standards of private schools?
I think there are some really, really great public schools. There's great public school classrooms, and you know, the notion of education freedom should not be a public versus private notion. And in fact, my definition of a public school is any setting, whether it's a school building and a traditional school as we think of it, or any learning environment that that prepares children to be leaders in the next generation, serves a public good, and therefore, in my view, should be considered a public school, a public service. I don't much care for the adjective that comes before the word school. I just care whether it's the right fit for every child that is participating there. And it's interesting to look at the states where the most education freedom has been available for the longest period of time. Florida is the best example of that. Florida, in the districts where the highest percentage of children are going to schools other than their assigned school, the achievement level of all the kids in that district, including the ones that stay in the assigned schools, has continued to improve. Now, there hasn't been studies done on specifically what that causation is, but logically you can deduce that children for whom their assigned school is not working are now going to a place that is working for them, and they're doing better as a result. And the schools that those children have left have decided we better make some changes and we better do better at serving the students that we have, and having those benchmarks and that competition in other quarters is a laudable thing for the kids that stay in the schools that they were assigned to. So ultimately, all education experiences can and will improve in an environment of full-on education freedom. I mean, we see this in pretty much every other area of life, right? When you have choices, there's an orientation around continual improvement, and those that refuse to improve ultimately go out of business.
Okay. And then we have someone who would like you to comment on the following. Some charter schools are for-profit and receive state funding, but they don't have to report how much goes to instruction versus profit. Can you comment on that?
Well, first of all, let me just correct that. A charter school is a public school that receives public funding. There are charter schools that contract with private management companies for some of their administrative issues and matters. And so I think that is where the mix-up may be. And you know, I can speak about one charter school with which I'm fairly familiar, the one that Dick started, the West Michigan Aviation Academy, where the students are coming from 7 different counties, and about 24 kids every year graduate with their private pilot's license. It's an awesome school. They operate with less per student than the traditional public schools in the area. Charter schools are at a disadvantage financially in Michigan because of how the original charter legislation was set up and the funding for charters. I think that's actually a matter to be grappled with longer term. So they actually do more with less, and I think there's a lot of other charter school examples that have modeled that as well. So just a clarification that a charter school is a public school, and a charter school has to take any student that comes into its doors, whether they, if they're capped out per grade, then they have to do a lottery. They cannot take students based on, academic achievement or any other measure. So charter schools are serving a really, really important role and purpose in Michigan, and we need to see more of those options created too.
With the benefit of hindsight, have you a different opinion about January 6th and the Trump subpoenas?
No, I wrote about this in the epilogue, and it was a very tough day. It was, I was in my office in the morning, and I could see the Capitol right from my office. And I ultimately resigned because I didn't feel the president I felt his rhetoric, it's debatable. There's lots of things that are debatable about that, but I didn't feel he did what he needed to do to stop what was happening in the unfolding of that. And it was very, very difficult to see and hear. And I thought about kids watching what was happening on TV and their confusion around that, and just the kind of example that adults were setting in that case or not setting. And I just, it was a tough series of events and day and time. And, I ultimately decided I had to put a stake in the ground around that.
Why is homeschooling becoming more popular?
Well, I think homeschooling's become a lot more popular because a lot of folks figured out that it works pretty well for their children, and out of necessity, during all of the lockdowns and the distance learning that wasn't executed well, and the curiosity around probably exploring more about what the resources were for homeschooling families. And so I think that lots of folks have decided this is working really well for their children, and they want to be able to continue that. And I applaud that. I think it's great. Well, as I write about in the book, we homeschooled our 2 daughters for 3 years for a variety of reasons, and it was a great experience, and the right answer for them at those years of their lives. And it's a great option for a lot of kids.
Could I just insert here? Could we go back to the previous question? January 6th, the reason being the 25th Amendment means a lot to the folks who are, familiar with President Ford's life and career, because it was under the terms of the 25th Amendment he became the first unelected vice president and then the first unelected president. But the 25th Amendment became important on January 6th and 7th, and you grappled with it. As you were talking to your colleagues in the cabinet, could you tell us really what it was like, Betsy, to go into depth in that?
Well, I was only cursorily familiar with the 25th Amendment, and so I really wanted to understand, does this potentially apply in this case, and if so, how does it actually work? And so I did have a number of conversations that day about how that would unfold. And when it was clear from Vice President Pence that he was not going to pursue that, or he would not go that direction, then it became clear to me what I had to do.
Well, I'll end on this final question, and I say this as I'm wearing my maize and blue, so be careful what you say. What's your favorite college or university?
Well, I'm a Calvin College, now university grad. But all four of our children went to completely different institutions, and I would say I really don't have a favorite. There are a lot of great institutions of higher learning, and there are a lot of them that I really wonder about their longevity. I think this is a whole nother area we could go into. I think higher education is headed toward a major reset, reorientation as well. And that could be a whole nother discussion, but there are a lot of great colleges and universities, and I was privileged to attend one, and I know my children are very happy with their chosen institutions, as was my husband, and so I'll leave it at that.
Very diplomatic.
answer. Well, we've had quite a conversation, and thank you so much for being with us and telling us more about your background and giving us the chance to see, I think, the real Betsy DeVos and not just the sort of the politicized caricature we so often see. And, to see the depth of your commitment to our children and improving their lives. I mean, that's really the future of our country. I can't think of anything that's more important. So thank you for all your work in that, and I know you're going to stay busy. I know this is not the end of your endeavor. So thanks so much, and we have just a modest gift for you, and are so appreciative that you've spent this time with us. So you can't leave the fort.
Please, thank you again for the opportunity, and thank you all for being here and your interest, and especially your interest in education and our nation's future. Our kids do represent 100% of our future.
Well, thank you very much. Let's give her another round of applause.